everybody. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad that you could join me today for another reading of Wicked. Yes, very exciting. For those of you who are just joining us, if you have missed any of the previous readings of Wicked, that's okay. Do not panic. In my channel, on my playlist, I have this that I have read so far, the other previous readings. Also, any of the other books that I have also read. Um, it kind of runs the gambit from historical fiction, biblical fiction, just straight up just fantasy. Um, all of that is listed on my playlist on my channel. Everything is in sequential order. You don't have to do any guesswork about what chapters and books and whatever. It's all listed for you. Easy to follow, no problem whatsoever. So if you have missed any of the readings that we've done of Wicked so far, it's okay. Come back to this video once you've caught up with our previous readings, and you'll be right on track. So typically what I do is I read every Monday from like 8 to 9, 8 to 9:15ish, something, if you want to catch me live, East Coast time. But naturally, if you just catch me on my channel, just kind of after I've posted this, hi anyway, come join me when I'm here live every Monday, 8 to 9, 8 to 9:30. It just kind of depends on the book, depends on my voice, all that fun stuff. So as you can see, we have gotten just about halfway through with Wicked. So just a real quick, there are technically spoilers in here. So if you haven't seen the stage play, if you haven't watched the first of two movies, this is going to give some spoilers. This book is a lot darker. The themes are a lot more adult than you would see in the stage play, than what you see in the movie. So if you are with your kids watching me read this book thinking, oh, cool, Wizard of Oz, Wicked, we love that. This is not for kids. This is not for little kids. There's very adult themes in this book. You've been warned. So there are kind of spoilers and there are adult themes in this book. Not for little kids. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, so far just a real quick recap of where we are in the book. Hi, Martin. Eli, hello. Amelia, hi. Hello. Welcome everybody. Oh my goodness, hi. So just a real quick recap. We have met Elphaba. We've gotten her backstory. We have met Glinda. We have been to Shiz University so far. We've met Madame Morrible. We've met Bach, Dr. Dillamond. We kind of, sort of, well, I don't want to give too much away, because obviously I want you guys to go back and watch my previous videos. So that's who we've seen. This is kind of where we are. As per last week's reading, Dr. Dillamond has been found dead. Spoiler alert, I know that's not what happens in the movies, but we unfortunately lost Dr. Dillamond last week. So there's that. Let's see. Oh, hello, thanks guys. Oh my goodness. Hello. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure your eyes are lovely too. I am from the East Coast, USA, so that's where I'm from. Ashlyn Leroy? I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Hi, thank you. Rylan, hello. What's up? Hey, John, oh my goodness. Hi, Jackson. El skate. No hablo español. Un poco. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started reading. And so like I said, we're going to go for about an hour here, and I hope you guys stick around. If not, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next week. So, The Charmed Circle. The There was no doubt in the minds of anyone who has seen the corpse that the word, the correct word, was murder. The way the pelt about the neck had bunched up, caked together like an improperly cleaned worker's paintbrush, the raw amber hollow in the eye. The official story was that the doctor had broken a magnifying lens and stumbled against it, cutting an artery in the process. But nobody believed it. The only one they could think of to ask, Amma Clutch, merely smiled when they came to visit, with handfuls of pretty yellowing leaves or a plate of late Pertha grapes. She devoured the grapes and chatted with the leaves. It was an ailment no one had ever seen before. Glinda, for out of some belated apology for her initial rudeness to the martyred goat, she now called herself as he had once called her. Glinda seemed to be stricken dumb before the fact of Amma Clutch. Glinda wouldn't visit, nor discuss the poor woman's condition, so Elphaba sneaked in once or twice a day. Bock assumed that Amma Clutch suffered a passing malady, but after 3 weeks Madame Morrible began to make sounds of concern that Elphaba and Glinda, still roomies, had no chaperone. She suggested the common dormitory for them both. Glinda, who would no longer go to see Madame Morrible on her own, nodded and accepted the demotion. It was Elphaba who came up with a solution, mostly to salvage some shred of Glinda's dignity. Thus it was that 10 days later Bock found himself in the beer garden of the Cock and Pumpkins, waiting for the midweek coach from the Emerald City. Madame Morrible didn't allow Elphaba and Glinda to join him, so he had decided for himself which two of the 7 passengers alighting were Nanny and Nessa Rose. The deformities of Elphaba's sister were well concealed, Elphaba had warned him. Nessa Rose could even descend from a carriage with grace, providing the step was secure and the ground flat. Hello, everyone. He met them and said hello. Nanny was a stewed plum of a woman, red and loose, her old skin looking ready to trail off but for the tucks at the corners of her mouth, the fleshy rivets by the edge of the eyes. More than a score of years in the badlands of Quadling country had made her lethargic, careless, and saturated with resentment. At her age she ought to have been allowed to nod off in some warm chimney nook. "Good to see you, little Munchkinlander," she murmured to Buck. "It's like the old times." Then she turned and said into the shadows, "Come, my puppet." He had not been warned. Had he not been warned, Bock wouldn't have taken Nessa Rose as Elphaba's sister. She was by no means green, or even blue-white like a genteel person with bad circulation. Nessa Rose stepped from the carriage elegantly, gingerly, strangely, sinking her heel to touch the iron step at the same time as her toe. Walking as oddly as she did, she drew attention to her feet, which kept eyes away from the torso, at least at first. The feet landed on the ground, driven there with a ferocious intention to balance, and Nessa Rose stood before him. She was, as Elphaba had said, gorgeous, pink, slender as a wheat stalk, and armless. The academic shawl over her shoulders was cunningly folded to soften the shock. Hello. Welcome to the read. "Hello, good sir," she said, nodding her head very slightly. "The valises are on top. Can you manage?" Her voice was as smooth and oiled as Elphaba's was serrated. Nanny propelled Nessa Rose gently toward the hansom cab that Bock had engaged. He saw that Nessa Rose did not move well without being able to lean backward against a steadying hand. "So now Nanny has to see the girls through their schooling," said Nanny to Bock as they rode along. "What with their sainted mother in her waterlogged grave these long years, and their father off his head. Well, the family always was bright, and brightness, as you know, decays brilliantly. Madness is the most shining way. The elderly man, the eminent Throp, he's still alive, and sensible as an old plowshare. Survived his daughter and his granddaughter. Elphaba is the Throp third descending. She'll be the eminence one day. As a Munchkinlander, you know about such things." "Nanny, don't gossip. It hurts my soul, Nessa Rose said. Oh, my pretty, don't you fret. This Bach is an old friend, or as good as, said Nanny. Out in the swamps of Quadling Hell, my friend, we've lost the art of conversation. We croak in chorus with what's left of the froggy folk. I intend to have a headache from shame, said Nessa Rose charmingly. But I knew Elfie when she was a small thing, said Bach. I'm from Rush Margins in Wen Hardings. I must have met you too. Primarily, I preferred to reside at Cowlin Grounds, said Nanny. I was a mortal comfort to the Lady Partra, the Throp's second descending, but occasionally I visited Rush Margins. So I may have met you when you were young enough to run around without trousers. How do you do? Said Nessa Rose. The name is Bach, said Bach. This is Nessa Rose, said Nanny, as if it were too painful for the girl to introduce herself. She was to come up to Shiz next year, but we have learned there is a problem with some Gillicanese minder going loopy, so Nanny is called to step in. And can Nanny leave her sweet? You see why not. A sad mystery. We hope for improvement, said Bach. At Crage Hall, Bach witnessed the reunion of the sisters, which was warm and gratifying. Madame Morrible had her grammatic thing wheel out tea and brisks for the Throp females, and for Nanny, Bach and Glinda. Bach, who had begun to worry about Glinda's retreat into silence, was relieved to see Glinda cast a hard, appraising eye over the elegant dress of Nessa Rose. How could it be, he wondered, if Glinda was wondering, that two sisters could each be disfigured, and should clothe themselves so unalike? Elphaba wore the humblest of dark frocks. Today she was in a deep purple, almost a black. Nessa Rose, balanced on a sofa next to Nanny, who, assisted by lifting teacups and crumbling buttery bits of crumpet, was in green silks, the colors of moss, emerald, and yellow-green roses. Green Elphaba, sitting on her other side and lending her support between the shoulders as she tilted her head back to sip her tea, looked like a fashion accessory. The whole arrangement is highly unusual, Madame Morrible was saying, but we don't have unlimited room to accommodate peculiarities, alas. We'll leave Miss Elphaba and Miss Galinda. Glinda, is it now, dear? How novel. We'll leave those two old pals as they are, and we'll set you up, Miss Nessa Rose, with your Nanny in the adjoining room that poor old Amma Clutch had. It's small, but you must think of it as cozy. But when Amma Clutch recovers? Asked Glinda. Oh, but my dear, said Madame Morrible, such confidence the young have. Touching, really. She continued in a more steely voice. You have already told me of the long-standing recurrence of this unusual medical condition. I can only assume this has deteriorated into a permanent relapse. She munched a biscuit in her slow, fishy way, her cheeks going in and out like the leather flaps of a bellows. Of course, we can all hope. Not much more than that, I'm afraid. And we can pray, Nessa Rose said. Oh, well, yes, that, said the head. That goes without saying among people of good breeding, Miss Nessa Rose. Bach watched Nessa Rose and Elphaba both blush. Glinda excused herself and went away. The unusual pang of panic Bach felt at her departure was softened by knowing he would see her again in life sciences next week, for, with the new prohibitions on animal hiring, the colleges had decided to give assembly lectures to all the students from all the colleges at once. Bach would see Glinda at the first coeducation lecture ever held at Shiz. He couldn't wait. Though she had changed. She had surely changed. Oh, thanks, Rez. Chapter 2. Glinda was changed. She knew it herself. She had come to Shiz a vain, silly thing, and she now found herself in a coven of vipers. Maybe it was her own fault. She had invented a nonsense disease for Amma Clutch, and Amma Clutch had come down with it. Was this proof of an inherent talent of sorcery? Glinda opted to specialize in sorcery this year, and accepted it as her punishment that Madame Morrible didn't change her roomie as promised. Glinda no longer cared. Beside Dr. Dillamond's death, a lot of other matters now seemed insignificant. But she didn't trust Madame Morrible either. Glinda had told nobody else that stupid and extravagant lie, so now she would no longer allow Madame Morrible so much as a finger-hold into her life, and Glinda still didn't have the nerve to confess her unintentional crime to anyone. While she fretted, Bock, that pesky little flea, kept zizzing around her looking for attention. She was sorry she had let him kiss her. What a mistake! Well, all that was behind her now, that trembling on the edges of social disaster. She had seen the Mrs. Fanny, etc., for what they were, shallow, self-serving snobs, and she would have no more to do with them. So Elphaba, no longer a social liability, had all the potential of becoming an actual friend, if being saddled with this broken doll of a baby sister didn't interfere too much. It was only with prodding that Glinda had gotten Elphaba to talk at all about her sister, so that Glinda might be prepared for Nessa Rose's arrival and the enlargement of their social circle. She was born at Colwyn Grounds when I was about 3, Elphaba had told her. My family had gone back to Colwyn Grounds for a short stay. It was one of those times of intense drought. Our father told us later, after our mother had died, that Nessa Rose's birth had coincided with a temporary resurgence of well water in the vicinity. They'd been doing pagan dances, and there was a human sacrifice. Glinda had stared at Elphaba, who sounded at once unwilling and offhand. A friend of theirs, a quadling glassblower. The crowd, incited by some rabble-rousing faithers and a prophetic clock, fell on him and killed him. A man named Turtleheart. Elphaba had pressed the palms of her hands over the high uppers of her stiff black second-hand shoes and kept her eyes trained on the floor. I think that was why my parents became missionaries to the Quadling people, why they never went back to Colwyn Grounds or Munchkinland. But your mother died in childbirth, said Glinda. How could she have ever been a missionary? She didn't die for 5 years, said Elphaba, looking at the folds of her dress, as if the story were an embarrassment. She died when our younger brother was born. My father named him Shell, after Turtleheart, I think. So Shell and Nessa Rose and I lived the lives of gypsy children, slopping around from Quadling settlement to settlement with Nanny and our father, Frex. He preached, and Nanny taught us and raised us up and kept house such as we ever had, which wasn't much. Meanwhile, the wizard's men began draining the Badlands to get at the ruby deposits. It never worked, of course. They managed to chase the Quadlings out and kill them, round them up in settlement camps for their own protection, and starve them. They despoiled the Badlands, raked up the rubies, and left. My father went barmy over it. There never were enough rubies to make it worth the effort. We still have no canal system to run that legendary water from the Vincas all the way across country to Munchkinland, and the drought, after a few promising reprieves, continues unabated. The animals are recalled to the lands of their ancestors, to a ploy to give the farmers a sense of control over something, anyway. It's a systemic marginalizing of populations, Glinda. That's what the wizard's all about. We were talking about your childhood, said Glinda. Well, that's it. That's all part of it. You can't divorce your particulars from politics, Elphaba said. You want to know what we ate? How we played? I want to know what Nessa Rose is like. And Shell, said Glinda. Nessa Rose is a strong-willed semi-invalid, said Elphaba. She's very smart, and thinks she is holy. She has inherited my father's taste for religion. She isn't good at taking care of other people because she has never learned how to take care of herself. She can't. My father required me to babysit her through most of my childhood. What she will do when Nanny dies, I don't know. I suppose I'll have to take care of her again. Oh, what a hideous prospect for a life, said Glinda, before she could stop herself. But Elphaba only nodded grimly. I can't agree with you more, she said. As for Shell, continued Glinda, wondering what fresh pain she might tread upon. Male and white and whole, she said. He's now about 10, I guess. He'll stay at home and take care of our father. He is a boy, just as boys are. A little dull, maybe, but he hasn't had the advantages we've had. Which are? Prompted Glinda. Even for a short time, said Elphaba, we had a mother. Giddy, alcoholic, imaginative, uncertain, desperate, brave, stubborn, supportive woman. We had her, Melina. Shell had no mother but Nanny, who did her best. And who was your mother's favorite? Said Glinda. Can't tell that, said Elphaba casually. Don't know. Would have been Shell, probably, since he's a boy. But she died without seeing him, so she didn't even get that small consolation. Your father's favorite? Oh, that's easy, said Elphaba, jumping up and finding her books on her shelf, and getting ready to run out and stop the conversation in its tracks. That's Nessa Rose. You'll see why when you meet her. She'd be anyone's favorite. She skidded out of the room with no more than a brief flurry of green fingers and a goodbye. Glinda wasn't so sure she favored Elphaba's sister. Nessa Rose seemed so demanding. Nanny was overly attentive, and Elphaba kept suggesting adjustments in their living arrangements to make things perfect. Hitch the drapes to this angle instead of that, to keep the touch of the sun of off Nessa Rose's pretty skin. Can we have the oil lamp turned up high so Nessa Rose can read? Shh! No chatting after hours. Nessa Rose has retired, and she is such a light sleeper. Glinda was a bit awed by Nessa Rose's freaky beauty. Nessa Rose dressed well, if not extravagantly. She deflected attention from herself, though, by a system of little social tics, the head lowered in a sudden onslaught of devotion, the eyes batting. It was especially moving and irritating to have to wipe away a trickle of tears brought on by some epiphany in Nessa Rose's rich inner spiritual life, of which bystanders could have no inkling. What did one say? Glinda began to retreat into her studies. Sorcery was being taught by a louche new instructor named Miss Grayling. She had a gushing respect for the subject, but it soon became apparent little natural ability. At its most elemental, a spell is no more than a recipe for change, she would flute at them. But when the chicken she tried to turn into a piece of toast became instead a mess of used coffee grounds, cupped in a lettuce leaf, the students all made a mental note never to accept an invitation to dine with her. In the back of the room, creeping with pretend invisibility so that she might observe, Madame Morrible shook her head and clucked. Once or twice she could not stop herself from interfering. No dab hand in the sorcerer's parlor eye, she would protest. Yet surely, Miss Grayling, you've omitted the steps to bind and convince. I'm merely asking. Let me try. You know I take a special pleasure in our training of sorceresses. Inevitably, Miss Grayling sat on what was left of a previous demonstration, or, dropping her purse, collapsing into a heap of shame and mortification. The girls giggled, and didn't feel that they were learning much. Or were they? The benefit of Miss Grayling's clumsiness was that they were not afraid to try for themselves, and she didn't stint at enthusiasm if a student managed to accomplish the day's task. The first time Glinda was able to mask a spool of thread with a spell of invisibility, even for a few seconds, Miss Grayling clapped her hands and jumped up and down and broke a heel off her shoe. It was gratifying and encouraging. Not that I have any objection, said Elphaba one day when she and Glinda and Nessa Rose, and inevitably Nanny, sat under a pearl fruit tree by the Suicide Canal. But I have to wonder. How does the university get away with teaching sorcery when its original charter was so strictly unionist? Well, there isn't anything inherently either religious or non-religious about sorcery, said Glinda. Is there? There isn't anything inherently pleasure-faithist about it either. Spells, changings, apparitions, it's all entertainment, said Elphaba. It's theater. Well, it can look like theater, and in the hands of Miss Grayling it often looks like bad theater, admitted Glinda. But the gist of it isn't concerned with application. It's a practical skill like reading and writing. It's not that you can, it's what you read or write. Or if you'll excuse the play on words, what you spell. Father disapproved mightily, Nessa Rose said, in the dulcet tones of the unflappably faithful. Father always said that magic was the sleight of hand of the devil. He said pleasure faith was no more than an exercise to distract the masses from the true object of their devotion. That's a unionist talking, said Glinda, not taking offense. A sensible opinion, if what you're up against is charlatans or street performers. But sorcery doesn't have to be that. What about the common witches up in the Gilcus? They say that they magic the cows they've imported from Munchkinland so they don't go mooing over the edge of some precipice. Who can ever afford to put a fence on every ledge there? The magic is a local skill, a contribution to community well-being. It doesn't have to supplant religion. It may not have to, said Nessa Rose, but if it tends to, then have we a duty to be wary of it? Oh, wary? Well, I'm wary of the water I drink. It might be poisoned, said Glinda. That doesn't mean I stop drinking water. Well, I don't even think it's so big an issue, said Elphaba. I think sorcery is trivial. It's concerned with itself mostly. It doesn't lead outward. Denise, we are reading Wicked. So if you have missed any of the previous readings, I have them on my playlist on my channel, but please feel free to stick around and enjoy. Glinda concentrated very hard and tried to make Elphaba's leftover sandwich elevate outward over the canal. She only succeeded in exploding the thing in a small combustion of mayonnaise and shredded carrot and chopped olives. Nessa Rose lost her balance laughing, and Nanny had to prop her up again. Elphaba was covered in bits of food, which she picked off herself and ate, to the disgust and laughter of everyone else. It's all effects, Glinda, she said. There's nothing ontologically interesting about magic. Not that I believe in unionism either, she protested. I'm an atheist and an aspiritualist. You say that to shock and scandalize, said Nessa Rose primly. Glinda, don't listen to a word of her. She always does this, usually to make Father irate. Father's not around, Elphaba reminded her sister. I stand in for him, and I am offended, said Nessa Rose. It's all very well to turn your nose up at unionism when you have been given a nose by the unnamed god. It's quite funny, isn't it, Glinda? Childish. She looked spitting angry. Father's not around, said Elphaba again, in a tone that verged on the apologetic. You needn't rush to public defense of his obsessions. What you term his obsessions are my articles of faith, she said, with a chilly clarity. Well, you're not a bad sorceress for a beginner, said Elphaba, turning to Glinda. That was a pretty good mess you made of my lunch. Thank you, Glinda said. I didn't mean to pelt you with it, but I am getting better, aren't I? And out in public. A shocking display, Nessa Rose said. That's exactly what Father would have deplored about sorcery. The allure is all in the surface. I agree. It still tastes like olives, Elphaba said, finding a clump of black olive in her sleeve and holding it out on the tip of her finger to her sister's mouth. Taste, Nessa? But Nessa Rose turned her face away and lost herself in silent prayer. Chapter 3. A few days later, Bach managed to catch Elphaba's eye at the break of their life sciences class, and they met up in an alcove off the main corridor. What do you think of this new Dr. Nicky Dick, he asked. I find it hard to listen, she said, but that's because I still want to hear Dr. Dillamond, and I can't believe he's gone. On her face was a look of gray submission to impossible reality. Well, that's one of the things I'm curious about, he said. You told me all about Dr. Dillamond's breakthrough. Do you know if his lab has been cleared out yet? Maybe there's something there worth finding. You took the notes for him. Couldn't they be the basis of some proposal, or at least some further study? She looked at him with a wiry, strong expression. Do you think I'm not way ahead of you? She asked. Of course I went tramping through there the day his body was found, before anyone could lace up the floor with padlocks and binding spells. Bach, Do you take me for a fool?" "No, I don't take you for a fool, so tell me what you found," he said. "His findings are well hidden away," she said, "and though there are colossal holes in my training, I am studying it on my own." "You mean you're not going to show me?" He was shocked. "It was never your particular interest," she said. "Besides, until there's something to prove, what's the point? I don't think Dr. Dillamond was there yet." "I am a Munchkinlander," he answered proudly. "Look, Elfie, you've more or less convinced me what the wizard is up to. The confining of animals back onto farms to give the dissatisfied Munchkinlander farmers the impression he's doing something for them, and also to provide forced labor for the sinking of useless new wells. It's vile, but this affects Wend Hardings and the towns that sent me here. I have a right to know what you know. Maybe we can figure it out together. Work to make a change." "You have too much to lose," she said. "I'm going to take this on myself." "Take what on?" She only shook her head. "The less you know, the better. And I mean for your sake. Whoever killed Dr. Dillamond doesn't want his findings made public. What kind of friend would I be to you if I put you at risk too?" "What kind of would I be to you if I didn't insist?" he retorted. But she wouldn't tell him. When he sat next to her during the rest of the class and passed her little notes, she ignored them all. Later he thought that they might have developed a genuine impasse in their friendship, had the odd attack on the newcomer not occurred during that very session. Dr. Nicodick had been lecturing on the life force. Entwining around each wrist the two separate tendrils of his long, straggly beard, he spoke in falling tones that only the first half of each sentence made it to the back of the room. Hardly a single student was following. When Dr. Nicodick took a small bottle from his vest pocket and mumbled something about extract of biological intention, only the students in the front row sat up and opened their eyes. For Bach and Elphaba and everyone else, the patter ran. "A little sauce for the soup, mumble, mumble," as if creation were an unconcluded mumble, 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 notwithstanding the obligations of all sentient mumble, 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 and so as a little exercise to make those nodding off in the back of the mumble, 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 behold, a little mundane miracle, courtesy of mumble, mumble, mumble. A frisson of excitement had woken everyone up. The doctor uncorked the smoky bottle and made a jerky movement. They could all see a small puff of dust, like an effervescence of talcum powder, jostle itself in a swimming plume in the air above the neck of the bottle. The doctor rode his hands a couple of times to start the air currents eddying upward. Keeping some rare sort of spatial coherence, the plume began to migrate upward and over. The oohs that the students were inclined to make were all postponed. Dr. Nicodick held a finger out to them to shush them, and they could tell why. A vast intake of breath would change the pattern of air currents and divert the floating musk of powder. But the students began to smile despite themselves. Above the stage, amid the standard ceremonial stag's horns and brass trumpets on braid, hung 4 oil portraits of the founding fathers of Ozma Towers. In their ancient garb and serious expressions, they looked down on today's students. If this biological intention were to be applied to one of the founding fathers, what would he say? Seeing men and women students together in the great hall, what would he have to say about anything? It was a grand moment of anticipation. But when a door to the side of the stage opened, the mechanics of the air currents were disturbed. A student looked in, puzzled. A new student, oddly dressed in suede leggings and a white cotton shirt, with a pattern of blue diamonds tattooed on the dark skin of his face and hands. No one had seen him before, or anyone like him. Bach clutched Elphaba's hand tightly and whispered, "Look, a Winky!" And so it seemed. A student from the Vincus, in strange ceremonial garb, coming late for class, opening the wrong door, confused and apologetic, but the door had shut behind him and locked from this side, so there were no nearby seats available in the front rows. So he dropped where he was and sat with his back against the door, hoping, no doubt, to look inconspicuous. "Drat and damn, the thing's been shabbed off course," said Dr. Nicodick. "You fool, why didn't you come to class on time?" The shining mist, about the size of a bouquet of flowers, had veered upward in a draught, and it bypassed the ranks of long-dead dignitaries waiting an unexpected chance to speak again. Instead it cloaked one of the racks of antlers, seeming for a few moments to hang itself on the twisting prongs. While I can scarcely hope to hear a word of wisdom from them, and I refuse to waste any more of this precious commodity on classroom demonstrations, said Dr. Nicodic. The research is still incomplete, and I had thought that mumble, mumble, mumble. Let you discover for yourselves if mumble, mumble, mumble. I should hardly wish to prejudice your mumble. The antlers suddenly took a convulsive twist on the wall and wrenched themselves out of the oaken paneling. They tumbled and clattered to the floor, to the shrieking and laughing of the students, especially because for a minute Dr. Nickdick didn't know what the uproar was about. He turned around in time to see the antlers right themselves and wait, quivering, twitching, on the dais like a fighting cock all nastied up and ready to go into the ring. "Oh, well, don't look at me," said Dr. Nicodic, collecting his books. "I didn't ask for anything from you. Blame that one, if you must." And he casually pointed at the Vinca student, who was cowering so wide-eyed that the more cynical of the older students began to suspect this was all a setup. The antlers stood on their points and skittered, crab-like, across the stage. As the students rose in a common scream, the antlers scrabbled up the body of the Vincas boy and pinned him against the locked door. One wing of the rack caught him by the neck, shackling him in its V-yoke, and the other reared back in the air to stab him in the face. Dr. Nicodic tried to move fast and fell to his arthritic knees, but before he could right himself, two boys were up on the stage, out of the front row, grabbing the antlers and wrestling them to the ground. The Vincas boy shrieked in a foreign tongue. "That's Crope and Tibbet," said Bach, jouncing Elphaba in the shoulder. "Look!" The sorcery students were all jumping on their seats and trying to lob spells at the murderous antlers, and Crope and Tibbet found their grips and lost them and found them again, until at last they succeeded in breaking off one driving tine, then another, and the pieces, still twitching, fell to the stage floor without further momentum. "Oh, the poor guy," said Bach, for the Vincas student had slumped down and was volubly weeping behind his blue diamond hands. "I never saw a student from the Vincas before. What an awful welcome to Shiz." Poor kid. Bye, Denise. Thank you for stopping by. Good Lord, I missed my mouth. The attack on the Vincas student provoked gossip and speculation. In Sorcery the next day, Glinda asked Miss Grayling to explain something. How could Dr. Nicodic's extract of biological intention, or whatever it was, how could it fall under the heading of life sciences when it behaved like a master spell? What really is the difference between science and sorcery? "Ah," said Miss Grayling, choosing this moment to apply herself to the care of her hair, "science, my dears, is the systematic dissection of nature, to reduce it to working parts that more or less obey universal laws. Sorcery moves in the opposite direction. It doesn't rend, it repairs. It is synthesis rather than analysis. It builds anew rather than revealing the old. In the hands of someone truly skilled," at this she jabbed herself with a hairpin and yelped, "it is art. One might in fact call it the superior or the finest art. It bypasses the fine arts of painting and drama and recitation. It doesn't pose or represent the world. It becomes. A very noble calling." She began to weep softly with the force of her own rhetoric. Can there be a higher desire than to change the world? Not to draw utopian blueprints, but really to order change, to revise the misshapen, reshape the mistaken, to justify the margins of this ragged era of a universe, through sorcery to survive. At tea time, still awed and amused, Glinda reported Miss Grayling's little heartfelt speech to the two Throp sisters. Nessa Rose said, "Only the unnamed God creates, Glinda. If Miss Grayling confuses sorcery with creation, she is in grave danger of corrupting your morals." Well, said Glinda, thinking of Alma Clutch on the bed of mental pain Glinda once imagined for her, my morals aren't in the greatest shape to start out with, Nessa. Then if sorcery is to be helpful at all, it must be in reconstructing your character, said Nessa Rose firmly. If you apply yourself in that direction, I suspect it will be all right in the end. Use your talent at sorcery. Don't be used by it. Glinda suspected that Nessa Rose might develop a knack for being witheringly superior. She winced in advance, even while taking Nessa Rose's suggestion to heart. But Elphaba said, Glinda, that was a good question. I wish Miss Grayling had answered it. That little nightmare with the antlers looked more like magic than science to me, too. The poor Vincus fellow. Suppose we ask Dr. Nicodick next week? Whoever would have the courage to do that? Cried Glinda. Miss Grayling is at least ridiculous. Dr. Nicodick, with that lovable, bumbling, mumbling, incoherent way he has, he's so distinguished. At the Life Sciences lecture the following week, all eyes were on the new Vincus boy. He arrived early and settled himself in the balcony, about as far from the lectern as he could get. Bach had the suspicion of nomads all settled farmers possessed. But Bach had to admit that the expression in the new boy's eyes was intelligent. Averick, sliding into the seat next to Bach, said, He's a prince, they say, a prince without a purse or a throne, a pauper noble. In his particular tribe, I mean. He stays at Ozma Towers, and his name is Fiyero. He's a real Winky, full blood. Wonder what he makes of civilization. If that was civilization last week, he must long for his own barbaric kind, said Elphaba, from the seat on the other side of Bach. What's he wearing such silly paint for, said Averick. He only draws attention to himself. And that skin. I wouldn't want to have skin the color of shit. What a thing to say, said Elphaba. If you ask me, that's a shitty opinion. Oh, please, said Bach. Let's just shut up. I forgot, Elfie. Skin is your issue, too, said Averick. Leave me out of this, she said. We just had lunch, and you give me dyspepsia. Wow, dyspepsia, Averick. You and the beans we had at lunch. I'm changing my seat, warned Bach. But Dr. Nicodick came in just then, and the class rose to its feet in routine respect, then settled back noisily, chummily, chattering. For a few minutes, Elphaba waved her hand to get the doctor's attention, but she was sitting too far back, and he was burbling on about something else. She finally leaned over to Bach and said, At the recess, I'll change my seat and go forward so he can see me. Then the class watched as Dr. Nicodick finished his inaudible preamble and beckoned a student to open the same door at the side of the stage that Fiyero had stumbled through the previous week. In came a boy from 3 Queens, rolling a table like a tea tray. On it, crouched as if to make itself as small as possible, was a lion cub. Even from the balcony they could sense the terror of the beast. Its tail, a little whip the color of mashed peanuts, lashed back and forth, and its shoulders hunched. It had no mane to speak of yet. It was too tiny. But the tawny head twisted this way and that, as if counting the threats. It opened its mouth in a terrified little yelp, the infant form of an adult roar. All over the room, hearts melted and people said, "Aww." Hardly more than a kitten, said Dr. Nicodick. I had thought to call it Purr, but it shivers more often than it purrs, so I call it Burr instead. The creature looked at Dr. Nicodick and removed itself to the far edge of the trolley. Now, the question of the morning is this, said Dr. Nicodick, picking up from the somewhat skewed interests of Dr. Dillamond, who mumble. Who can tell me if this is an animal or an animal? Elphaba didn't wait to be called on. She stood up in the balcony and launched her answer out in a clear, strong voice. Dr. Nicodick, the question you asked was who can tell if this is an animal or an animal? It seems to me the answer is that its mother can. Where is its mother? A buzz of amusement. Caught in the swamp of Of syntactical semantics, I see, said the doctor merrily. He spoke louder, as if having only now realized that there was a balcony in the hall. Well done, miss. Let me rephrase the question. Will someone here venture a hypothesis as to the nature of this specimen, and give a reason for such an assessment? We see before us a beast at a tender age, long before any such beast could command language, if language were part of its makeup. Before language, assuming language, is this still an animal? I repeat my question, doctor, sang out Elphaba. This is a very young cub. Where is its mother? Why is it taken from its mother at such an early age? How can it even feed? Those are impertinent questions to the academic issue at hand, said the doctor. Still, the youthful heart bleeds easily. The mother, shall we say, died in a sadly timed explosion. Let us presume, for the sake of argument, that there was no way of telling whether the mother was a lioness or a lioness. After all, as you may have heard, some animals are going back to the wild to escape the implications of the current laws. Elphaba sat down, nonplussed. It doesn't seem right to me, she said to Bok and Averick. For the sake of a science lesson to drag a cub in here without its mother. Look how terrified it is. It is shivering. And it can't be cold. Other students began to venture opinions, but the doctor shot them down one by one. The point being, apparently, that without language or contextual clues, at its infant stages a beast was not clearly animal or animal. This has a political implication, said Elphaba loudly. I thought this was life sciences, not current events. Bok and Averick shushed her. She was getting a terrible reputation as a loudmouth. The doctor dragged the episode out long after everyone had digested the point, but finally he turned and said, Now do you think that if we could cauterize that part of the brain that develops language, we could eliminate the notion of pain, and thus its existence? Early tests on this little Tom lion show interesting results. He had picked up a small hammer with a rubber head and a syringe. The beast drew itself up and hissed, and then backed up and fell to the floor, and streaked toward the door, which had closed and locked from this side as it had the previous week. But it wasn't only Elphaba who was on her feet yelling. Half a dozen students were shouting at the doctor. Pain? Eliminate pain? Look at the thing, it's terrified. It already gets pain. Don't do that. What are you, crazy? The doctor paused, visibly tightening his grip on the mallet. I will not preside over such shocking refusal to learn, he said, affronted. You are leaping to hair-brained conclusions based on sentiment and no observation. Bring the beast here. Bring it back. Young lady, I insist. I shall be quite cross. But two girls from Briscoe Hall disobeyed and ran out of the room, carrying the clawing lion cub in an apron between them. The room collapsed in an uproar, and Dr. Nicodic stalked off the stage. Elphaba turned to Bok and said, Well, I guess I don't get to ask Glinda's good question about the difference between science and sorcery, do I? We were definitely headed down a different path today. But her voice was shaking. You felt for that beast, didn't you? Bok was touched. Elfie, you're trembling. I don't mean this in an insulting way, but you've nearly gone white with passion. Come on, let's sneak out and get a tea at the cafe at Railway Square, for old time's sake. Very different than how they did it in the movie. Still no less effective. Chapter 4. Perhaps every accidental cluster of people has a short period of grace, in between the initial shyness and prejudice on the one hand, and eventual repugnance and betrayal on the other. For Bok, it seemed that his summer obsession with the then Galinda made sense if only to usher in this following, more mature comfort with a circle of friends who had begun to feel inevitably and permanently connected. The boys still weren't allowed to access Crage Hall, nor the girls to the boys' schools, but the city center area of Shiz became an extension of the parlors and lecture halls in which they were allowed to mingle. On a midweek afternoon, on a weekend morning, They would meet by the canal with a bottle of wine, or in a cafe or student watering hole, or they would walk about and discuss the fine points of Shiz architecture, or they would laugh about the excesses of their teachers. Bach and Averick, Elphaba and Nessa Rose, with Nanny, Glinda, and sometimes Fanny and Shenshen and Milla, and sometimes Crope and Tibbet. And Crope brought Fiero along and introduced him, which frosted Tibbet for a week or so until the evening that Fiero said, in his shy, formal way, "Of course, I have been married for some time. We marry young in the Vincus." The others were agog at the notion, and felt juvenile. To be sure, Elphaba and Averick needled each other mercilessly. Nessa Rose tried everyone's patience with her religious rantings. Crope's and Tibbet's stream of saucy remarks got them dumped in the canal more than once. But Bach was relieved to find that his crush on Glinda was lifting somewhat. She sat on the edge of the picnic blanket with a look of self-reliance, and she diverted conversation away from herself. He had loved the girl who had loved the glamour in herself, and that girl seemed to have disappeared. But he was happy to have Glinda as a friend. Well, in a nutshell, he had loved Galinda, and this was now Glinda. Somehow, he could no longer quite figure out. Case closed. It was a charmed circle. All the girls steered clear of Madame Morrible while they could. One cold evening, however, Grammatic came hunting for the Throp sisters. Nanny huffed and wound the strings of a fresh apron around her waist, and prodded Nessa Rose and Elphaba downstairs toward the parlor of the head. "I hate that Grammatic thing," said Nessa Rose. "However does it work, anyway? Is it clockwork, or is it magic, or some combination of the two?" "I always imagined a bit of nonsense, that there was a dwarf inside, or an acrobatic family of elves, each working a limb," said Elphaba. "Whenever Grammatic comes around, my hand gets a strange hunger for a hammer." "I can't imagine," Nessa Rose said. "Hand hunger, I mean." "Hush, you two, the thing has ears," Nanny said. Madame Morrible was glancing through the financial papers, making a few marks in the margin before she deigned to acknowledge her students. "This won't take but a moment," she said. "I've had a letter from your dear father, and a package for you. I thought it kindest to deliver the news myself." "News?" said Nessa Rose, blanching. "He could have written to us as well as to you," said Elphaba. Madame Morrible ignored her. "He writes to ask of Nessa Rose's health and progress, and to tell you both that he is going to undertake a fast and penance for the return of Ozma Tippetarius." "Oh, the blessed little girl," said Nanny, warming to one of her favorite subjects. "When the wizard took over the palace all those years ago, he had the Ozma regent jailed. We all thought that the sainted Ozma child would call down disaster upon the wizard's head. But they say she's been spirited away and frozen in a cave, like Lurlina. Has Frexbar got the metal to melt her? Is now her time to return?" "Please," said Madame Morrible to the sisters, with a sour glance at Nanny, "I haven't asked you here so that your Nanny could discuss this contemporary apocrypha, nor to slander our glorious wizard. It was a peaceful transition of power. That the Ozma regent's health failed while under house arrest was a mere coincidence, nothing more. As to the power of your father to raise the missing royal child from some unsubstantiated state of somnolence, well, you've much as admitted to me that your father is erratic, if not mad. I can only wish him health in his endeavors, but I feel it my duty to point out to you girls that we do not smile on seditious attitudes at Crage Hall. I hope you have not imported your father's royalist yearnings into the dormitories here." "We assign ourselves to the unnamed god, not to the wizard, nor to any possible remnant of the royal family," Nessa Rose said proudly. "I have no feeling on the matter at all," muttered Elphaba, "except that father loves lost causes." "Very well," said the head, "as it should be. Now I have had a package for you." She handed it to Elphaba, but added, "It is for Nessa Rose, I think." "Open it, Elfie, please," said Nessa Rose. Nanny leaned forward to look. Elphaba undid the cord and opened the wooden box. From a pile of ash shavings she withdrew a shoe, and then another. Were they silver? Or blue? Or now red? Lacquered with a candy shell brilliance of polish? It was hard to tell, and it didn't matter. The effect was dazzling. Even Madame Morrible gasped at their splendor. The surface of the shoes seemed to pulse with hundreds of reflections and refractions. In the firelight, it was like looking at boiling corpuscles of blood under a magnifying glass. He writes that he bought them for you from some toothless tinker-woman outside Oval's, said Madame Morrible, and that he dressed them up with silver glass beads that he made himself, that someone had taught him to make? Turtle heart, said Nanny darkly. And Madame Morrible flipped the letter over, squinting. He says that he hoped to give you something special before you left for university, but in the sudden circumstances of Alma Clutch's sickness, blah blah, he was unprepared. So now he sends them to his Nessa Rose to keep her beautiful feet warm and dry and beautiful, and he sends them with his love. Elphaba drove her fingers through the curlicues of shavings. There was nothing else in the box. Nothing for her. Aren't they gorgeous? Nessa Rose exclaimed. Elfie, fix them on my feet, would you please? Oh, how they sparkle! Elphaba went on her knees before her sister. Nessa Rose sat as regal as any Ozma, spine erect and face glowing. Elphaba lifted her sister's feet and slipped off the common house slippers and replaced them with the dazzling shoes. How thoughtful he is, said Nessa Rose. Good thing you can stand on your own 2 feet, you, muttered Nanny to Elphaba, and put her old hand patronizingly on Elphaba's shoulder blades, but Elphaba shrugged it away. They're just gorgeous, said Elphaba thickly. Nessa Rose, they're made for you. They fit like a dream. Oh, Elfie, don't be cross, Nessa Rose said, looking down at her feet. Don't ruin my small happiness with resentment, will you? He knows you don't need this kind of thing. Of course not, said Elphaba. Of course I don't. That evening the friends risked breaking curfew by ordering another bottle of wine. Nanny tutted and fretted, but as she kept downing her portion as neatly as anyone else, she was overruled. Fierro told the story of how he had been married at the age of 7 to a girl from a neighboring tribe. They all gawped at his apparent lack of shame. He had only seen his bride once, by accident, when they were both about 9. I won't really take up with her until we are 20, and I'm now only 18, he added. With the relief of imagining he might still be as virginal as the rest of them, they ordered yet another bottle of wine. The candles guttered. A small autumnal rain fell. Though the room was dry, Elphaba drew her cloak about her as if anticipating the walk home. She had gotten over the sting of being overlooked by Frex. She and Nessa Rose began to tell funny stories about their father, as if to prove to themselves and to everyone else that nothing was amiss. Nessa Rose, who wasn't much of a drinker, allowed herself to laugh. Despite my appearance, or maybe because of it, he always called me his beautiful pet, he said, alluding to her lack of arms, for the first time in public. He would say, "Come here, my pet, and let me give you a piece of apple." And I would walk over as best I could, tilting and tottering if Nanny or Elfie or Mother wasn't around to support me, and fall into his lap, and lean up smiling, and he'd drop small pieces of fruit into my mouth. "What did he call you, Elfie?" asked Glinda. "He called her Fabula," interrupted Nessa Rose. At home only," said Elphaba. "True, you are your father's little Fabula," crooned Nanny, almost to herself, just outside the circle of smiling faces. "Little Fabula, little Elphaba, little Elfie." "He never called me pet," said Elphaba, raising her glass to her sister, "but we all know he told the truth, as Nessa Rose is the pet in the family, hence those splendid shoes." Nessa Rose blushed and accepted a toast. "Ah, but while I had his attention because of my condition, you captured his heart when you sang," she said. "Captured his heart? Huh! You mean I performed a necessary function." But the others said to Elphaba, "Oh, do you sing? Well then, sing! Sing, you must! Another bottle, another glass! Push back the chair, and before we leave for the night, you must sing! Go on!" "Only if the others will," said Elphaba, bossily. "Bach, some Munchkinlander's spinniel, Averick, a Gilliganese ballad, Glinda, Nanny, a lullaby." "We all know a dirty round. We'll go next if you go," said Crope and Tibbet. "And I will sing a Vincus hunting chant," said Fiyero. Everyone chortled with pleasure and clapped him on the back. So then Elphaba had to stand, push her chair aside, clear her throat, and sound a note into her cupped hands and start. As if she were singing for her father again, after all this time. The bar mother slapped her rag at some noisy older men to shush them, and the dart players dropped their hands to their sides. The room quieted down. Elphaba made up a little song on the spot, a song of longing and otherness, of far-aways and future days. Strangers closed their eyes to listen. Bach did too. Good night, Ari. Thanks for stopping by. Bach did too. Elphaba had an okay voice. He saw the imaginary place she conjured up, a land where injustice and common cruelty and despotic rule and the beggaring fist of drought didn't work together to hold everyone by the neck. No, he wasn't giving her credit. Elphaba had a good voice. It was controlled and feeling and not histrionic. He listened through to the end, and the song faded into the hush of a respectful pub. Later, he thought, the melody faded like a rainbow after a storm, or like winds calming down at last, and what was left was calm and possibility and relief. "You next, you promised," cried Elphaba, pointing at Fiyero, but nobody would sing again, because she had done so well. Nessa Rose nodded to Nanny to wipe a tear from the corner of her eye. "Elphaba says she's not religious, but see how feelingly she sings of the afterlife," said Nessa Rose, and for once, no one was inclined to argue. All right. We will call that an evening. Thank you guys so very much for hanging out with me today and letting me read to you. I have been enjoying this immensely. So like I said at the beginning of the video, if you missed this reading, or if you've missed any of the other readings of this book or any of the other books that I have read, because I have read quite a few at this point. When I was on TikTok, I just pushed everything over here onto YouTube. Please feel free to check out all of my videos. My main content is going to be the book readings, and when I start getting my setup for... I did skits on TikTok. If you look through my channel and you go through all of those videos, you'll get an idea of what the character is, what the subject matter is all about. So I won't even go into that in this video right now. But more of that content is on the way. I'm still trying to kind of figure out how to do all of that in a different recording space. So that's going to take a little bit of time. But the book readings, these are going to be a sure thing every week. So without further ado, thank you so very much for joining me, and I will see you guys next week. Until then, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you soon. Bye.